How was your flight yesterday? Did you fall isolation? Oh, yeah, but what's expected noise?
Would you okay, I'm gonna put it over here if you wanna. Yes, please, go right ahead. I don't know if you come up and
The back.
Oh,
yeah.
45, that's fine.
And the clicker is thanks, man. Shall we? This is yours, baby. So you can be perfectly hydrated. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the David C. Baum Memorial Lecture on Civil Liberties and Civil Rights. Endowed in 1973 by the family and friends of David C. Baum in his memory, and at his request, this lecture series has served as a testament to Professor Baum's life and work. After graduating from Harvard College and Harvard Law School, Professor Baum clerked for Justice Walter V. Schaefer of the Illinois Supreme Court. He then practiced law at Ross McGowan Hardy's in O'Keefe in Chicago before joining our law faculty here in 1963, where he taught until his passing in 1973. Throughout its history, this lecture series has hosted the greatest thinkers on important legal issues of the day and is a fitting memorial to a man who made invaluable contributions to the legal academy and to the profession through his unrelenting intellectual vigor and moral commitment. Today's lecture adds to the Baum Lecture's illustrious history. We're pleased to welcome Dayna Bowen Matthew, the Dean and Harold H. Greene Professor of Law at the George Washington University Law School. A leader in public health and civil rights law who focuses on disparities in health, healthcare, and the social determinants of health, Dean Matthew is the author of the best-selling book, Just Medicine, A Cure for Racial Inequality in American Healthcare, and the more recent, Just Health, Treating Structural Racism to Heal America. She's also authored numerous articles and book chapters on health and antitrust law topics that have appeared in prominent journals and publications. Prior to her time at GW, Dean Matthews served on the faculty at the University of Virginia School of Law, where she co-founded and directed the Equity Center, a transdisciplinary research center that seeks to build better relationships between the University of Virginia and the Charlottesville community. She was previously a member of the law faculty at the University of Colorado, where she held numerous leadership positions, as well as a joint appointment at the Colorado School of Public Health. Outside of academia, Dean Matthew has taken on a variety of public policy roles. In 2013, she co-founded the Colorado Health Equity Project, a medical legal partnership aimed at removing healthcare barriers for low-income clients by providing legal representation, research, and policy advocacy. In 2015, she served as the senior advisor to the director of the Office of Civil Rights for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where she expedited cases on behalf of historically vulnerable communities besieged by pollution. She then joined the health policy team of U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan and worked on public health issues. During 2015-16, she served as a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Fellow in Residence in Washington, D.C., and reoriented her work toward toward population-level clients. She partnered with policy groups like the Brookings Institution, where she is currently a non-resident senior fellow, and the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. She's also a member of the American Law Institute and currently serves on several public health boards. Before entering the academy, Dean Matthew practiced as a civil litigator both in Kentucky at the law firm of Greene, Baum, Dahl, and McDonald, and in Virginia at McGuire Woods, where her work primarily focused on the defense of medical care providers and corporate manufacturers in state courts, federal courts, and before administrative and licensing tribunals. Dean Matthew earned her AB in economics from Harvard-Radcliffe, her JD from the University of Virginia, and her PhD in health and behavioral sciences from the University of Colorado at Denver. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Dean Matthew. Thank you.
The only thing I wish when I have, you got the long version of that. Thank you very much. It was really very kind. And the only thing I wish is that my children could hear this because they don't think as highly of me as you obviously do. There's a way for me to lift this. I'm going to hopefully not, I'm a little taller than, yeah, look at that. Wow. You guys have a beautiful building. You should see what we have in DC. I'm really grateful to be here. It's really quite an honor to give the David C. Baum lecture. I want to say thank you so much to the Dean and to Hannah and Carrie and all of the people that did so much to make it possible for me to be here. This really is quite an honor for a lot of reasons that I'll tell you. Somebody should wave at me when I get towards a half hour because the pleasure that I have today is not to do anything deanly. So instead of worrying about administering a law school and making sure that I handle the most recent protest or the arrival of the Walk of Peace and all of the things that a dean does, I get to think about the things that have always brought me to the law, the things that I'm passionate about. And I usually think about them in the context of current events, and on my mind right now is democracy. You heard that my background is in health, and so I'm going to marry the two and talk to you about democracy as a determinant of health. And let me say before I do that, that I'm working out an article project. So if at the end of this lecture you have either questions or comments that would help me do what I'd like to do better in this article, I welcome them. So let's think of this as a collaborative workshop together. So I am going to start by just outlining what you can expect from me. So if there's any point at which you start falling asleep, you'll say, oh, well, she's almost at the end. She said she only had 4 points. I'm going to answer a why, what, how, and so what series of questions. I'm going to start by answering the question, what are the reasons that we should care at all that there's a connection between democracy and health? Second, I'd like to turn to my understanding of the complex questions of what a democracy is and much more precisely what a healthy democracy is. I'll tell you in advance that I think you can measure the health of a democracy, and you can measure it in part by the health of its population. That'll be my 4th point. And then at the end, I'll introduce some of the reasons why we should care if we care about civil liberties, civil rights, as David Baum did, and the reason that we're here. So let's start with answering the question. The question of what health is much easier to answer than the question of what democracy is. So let me start by saying I'll talk to you about what health is and then marry the question of what a healthy democracy is. So the most often quoted definition of what health is comes from the World Health Organization, which basically said to us that health was more than just the absence of disease or the absence of illness. It was more than just the lack of an infirmity, but it was the opportunity to live a wholly healthy life, physiologically as well as socially. It was a comprehensive definition that got us started to thinking about health not only as it occurs in individuals, but as it occurs in populations and how the resources that make us healthy are distributed among populations. For that, we have a concept called the social determinants of health. A level set here, because many of you probably know this concept, but the idea came to us originally when Sir Michael Marmot, in I think about 1948, did a landmark study called the Whitehall Studies. By a show of hands, how many people already know about the Whitehall Studies? Okay, so I won't bore very many of you by telling you a little bit about the Whitehall Studies. These were 2 longitudinal studies in which a researcher, a sociologist, followed the health outcomes of civil servants in the United Kingdom. Because the United Kingdom civil service system is clearly hierarchical. We can tell what people make from one level and one class to another. To follow their health outcomes was a great way to reveal something called the social gradient. And that was that as people progressed along each of those hierarchical levels, from one class of civil servant to another, their health got better. Their longevity was greater. So the relationship was direct, it was positive, it was replicable, and it was valid. That said, people at a lower class income level, not just the poor, lived longer and lived healthier than people at the exact next level up. And the next level up lived healthier and longer. So when we say healthier, it would be by the exact biological outcomes that you would expect to see. Death due to the 7 major causes of disease: heart disease, cancer, stroke. So there were fewer of those the higher on the class level you were. So this is the origin of the idea of the social determinants of health. This is the idea that showed us what is pictured in this diagram here. And that is that health depends on much more than whether you get clinical access to medical care. Health depends much more than on your biological or genetic history. But the major determinant of health is your social and economic environment, the living conditions under which you find yourself living, working, and playing. That's what we mean by the social determinants of health. This was a revelation, and it enabled us to return to not only the question of what a healthy person is, that core in red on this diagram, you're healthy by your family history, your age, your gender, but also by what a healthy population is, groups of people that are grouped by demography or geography. A healthy population is defined by where they work, their level of education, their access to housing, their access to employment. These are the social determinants of health. And of course, the title of my talk suggests that I wish to add to this diagram and say the state of your government is another social determinant of health. So with those behind us, let's look then at what we can call democracy. This is much more complicated question. So more slides than one on this one. So democracy, I'm going to argue, is a macro social factor that has an impact on health. I'm saying that it is a determinant of health. But we could look at many, many examples of what a democracy might be. But I'm going to suggest, and if you get nothing else from this talk, that what Norman Daniels said is true for America, and that is that the health of our population is not only a byproduct of the justice of our population in America, but we can tell exactly how just a society we are by looking at our health outcomes. Especially if we look at those health outcomes from subgroup to subgroup within the American population. You with me? That's the takeaway from this entire lecture. So what is a healthy democracy? Let's start by saying what a democracy is in the first place. So the first or birthplace of democracy we tend to think of as Athens. The world's first democracy was developed in the 5th century. And we can think about the Greek words. I took Latin, not Greek, so if you're watching, you're probably going to hear me pronounce these incorrectly. but the very important principles that are enduring and have carried through to the American democracy are worth looking at here. So democracy, two parts of a word in Greek, demos meaning people, and kairos meaning rule. So rule by the people, that's the fundamental concept of democracy. In the Athenian case, the ancient case, there were a couple of principles that abide today as we think about American democracy, which is where I'm going, and the democracy for which I will compare the health of a population. But parousia in ancient Athens was the license to say what you please. We would call this freedom of speech. Asgoria would be the equality notion that in fact has endured and gone through to today's American democracy. Of course, you know the ill-fated outcome. The Spartans ended the Greek democracy, but we continue to talk about it, and many, many thinkers have given us lots of the core elements, which I've listed on this slide. Whether you talk about Plato, who actually wasn't that big a fan of democracy. He told us a few things about how democracy would likely lead to tyranny. It would likely, because of our obsession with individual rights, lead to such extremes that the population that claimed democracy would seek a protector ultimately, and that protector for their individual rights would become an autocrat. Pause. Think. But we see here the elements of a democracy: participation, equality, the rule of law, rights, elections. These are the things we think about if we are to define the characteristics of a democracy generally. But let's take up what distinguishes an American democracy specifically, right? If you think that there's a continuum, right, a pure democracy on one side, I'm not using my left hand for any reason, and autocracy, tyranny, or totalitarianism on the other end of the spectrum. Again, take nothing from the hands that I use, but along this continuum, there are different kinds of democracy. I want to turn now to taking up what the American democracy is. It's not a direct democracy, it's a representative democracy. And by that, both could be democracies. And by that, of course, we mean a Republican form of government where decisions are not made directly by the vote of individuals, but by those individuals who are elected. That's the American democracy. Three other people have something important for my thesis for me to share with you. They are Alexis de Tocqueville, John Adams, and W.E.B. Du Bois. Let's take them in turn. So Alexis de Tocqueville comes to America in order to understand what the American democracy is. He writes Democracy in America in 2 volumes in 1835 and 1840, and the first sentence of the book tells us what he found most remarkable when he got to the American democracy. It's quoted here: amongst the novel objects that attracted my attention during my stay in the United States, nothing struck me more forcibly than the general equality of conditions attainable only through democratic methods, openness, and free choice. So on that spectrum, if you look at the various elements that define and distinguish an American democracy, let's list equality and equality of participation. Now, this is the ideal. This is the ideal for which we have committed ourselves in our founding documents and on to today. Secondly, what did John Adams say? He was the famous orator who told us about the rule of law, that our democracy is an empire of laws, not of men. Maybe he wanted to include women, but forgot. But in any event, he was the one that told us that the American democracy was one that adhered to the rule of law, at least in its ideal. Let me stand for a moment with W.E.B. Du Bois, because his commentary on our democracy really is more of a critique, and it's a critique that does go to the health of the democracy as well as the health of the population. He specifically was really concerned with the arbitrary exclusion of populations in the United States that he said crippled our democracy. He very interestingly said that our democracy depended heavily on the education of our citizenry. He was very sure that democracy would ultimately lead to enlightenment, learning, and happiness. Those were the objectives he sought. He also said to achieve democracy in America, that peace and happiness that he sought and thought it would ultimately produce, we needed not only quality education, but an end to racial discrimination. The constitutional freedoms really had to mean something by the time W.E.B. Du Bois was writing. This was very important, and I can tell you that poverty was a key concern as a crippler of democracy, because he thought not only the political institution had to be democratic, but also the economic institution. One of the reasons I'm most excited about this project is because when I sought an article that he had written about what of the American democracy, what my library returned to me was a set of handwritten notes from a speech that W.E.B. Du Bois actually wrote. I have a picture here where he crossed out and rewrote and did what I was doing up until the last minute of this talk. And it's just like a feeling of history to hold those in your hand. So this is the critique of a democracy. So let me turn now to part 2. How do you measure the health of a democracy? The elections that make it possible for that equal participation to occur can actually be measured by statisticians and sociologists, and the freedom, the inclusivity, the fairness, and the decisiveness, that is, do people actually obey and respect the outcomes of elections, can actually be measured by a series of independent variables. So if I'm thinking independent variables, here are the things that explain the dependent variable, the outcome of democracy, how democratic is an institution. We can actually measure things like how competitive is an election? How frequent is fraud occurring? Is there universality in participation or suffrage? Are there safeguards in a polity against fraud in an election? Do elected officials have authority, or are there officials overseeing the fairness of elections? And are the basic civil and human rights in a society protected, right? So what I'm looking for now is a social science way to measure how healthy, how strong a democracy is. And what I've learned at this stage in my research is that you can do that. Social scientists, political scientists actually use these explanatory variables that go up and down in order to define the strength or the health of a democracy. Here are some examples. A greater level of democracy is associated with lower infant and under 5 infant mortality in the United States. A higher level of electoral fraud and irregularity, serious enough to affect outcomes, in a study of 179 countries from 1975 to 2012, will show that more serious outcomes of infant mortality move at the same time and in the opposite direction of fraud, right? So if you can measure the level of fraud, the higher the level of fraud, the higher the level of infant mortality. Now, these are causal relationships only if you buy my argument. The studies simply show correlation, but if I collect enough of them, I can begin to infer causality, which of course is the objective of my talk. In the early 20th century, female suffrage was associated with a lower disease-specific and age-specific mortality. In other words, the higher the participation of women in elections in the United States, the lower the disease-specific mortality was over time. Pause. When women got the vote, people got more healthy. Now, why is that necessarily? Does it mean that just because there was a different gender pulling the lever, they made life expectancy longer? No. The reason is that we're telling a theory of change story, a causal story that says when all people participate in elections, then the outcomes are more responsive to the needs of the polity. right? So we will have better health policy. We will have better representation of the needs of those that will ultimately produce better health outcomes. It isn't just because one gender pulls the lever or another gender pulls the lever. It's what happens as a result of the equal participation that comes from elections. Another one of my favorites is actually from Brazil, where the ease of voting, that is replacing paper ballots with electronic voting, making it possible for people to have access to voting, in other words, having more hours and more stations where people can vote, ultimately resulted in better health care legislation, rules, and policies being enacted by the government. Right? So you're beginning to see a pattern here where an increase in what we can measure as outcomes for a healthy population are correlated with an increase in what we can measure and call a democratic environment. So freedom of association is another one of those elements that we're talking about. And you'll see a pattern here. I will continue to show you examples of social science that correlate the kinds of outcomes that measure the freedom to assemble, the right to free expression, and health outcomes. Here, the independent variables will be political parties, the number of those that are active and meaningful, the number of non-government organizations that are available. And let me pause here to say that I'm reporting the greater weight of the evidence. These are not studies that are uniform. They don't all come out the same way, and they're not all conclusive. Moreover, I haven't gotten to the point in my research where I could also examine the validity and the internal strength and rigor of these studies. I'm just collecting them, and they're beginning to show me the greater weight of the evidence, which I'm sharing with you. Informal networks that give opportunity for voice, expression, assembly, the kind of freedom that is associated, again, not only with democracy generally, but with the American experiment in democracy. The presence of labor unions, one of my favorite examples, actually works, this is counterintuitive, against health outcomes. Whew, not sure why, but you've got to take the evidence as you find it. And certainly evidence of media and press freedom. Particularly this is important to the health of a population because in order to come up with the ideas that should be represented in a representative democracy, in order to coalesce, collaborate, and coordinate those things that will be informing voter outcomes, the freedom of assembly, the freedom to associate, and the freedom to speak are very essential to a democracy. So political parties, studies that find an association between left party governments and population health actually have a negative association. This is the labor union study. We could talk about it a little further. There's another labor unit study here. Where there are multiple parties, the higher the number of parties participating in a democracy, the more viewpoints or perspectives are reflected in the government, and that ends up being correlative with positive relationships to population health, as you see in the 2011 and 2018 studies that I'm showing here. Again, the mixed results from labor unions, as I said and betrayed a little earlier, where there are NGOs, the number of health and gender-associated NGOs, non-government organizations, tend to increase the level of democracy, the level of freedom of association and speech, and thereby the health outcomes of individuals and populations. I could do this for quite a while because the number of studies is beginning to convince me that there's a there. Some are in the United States, but some, and this is the last one I'll share with you on the freedom of assembly. Across 167 countries, we've observed annually that media freedom, that is the freedom of the press, is associated with increasing the reduction or decline of under 5 infant mortality. Right? Are you getting the picture that there is a relationship that's worth investigating and that the idea that justice indeed is a precursor to and therefore a byproduct of healthy democracies? So where we go next in this path towards looking at whether there is a social determinant of health that can be called democracy is to end on the inquiry that W.E.B. Du Bois offered for us to consider, and that is the role of education and its importance to an educated citizenry. So again, let me remind you that health really is a byproduct of justice, and to do this part of my talk, I'm going to introduce you to my parents. So this is my mom and my dad. They're no longer living. It's been a long time since they died because of the social determinants of health that they lived under. So you see here, my mom is 47, my father is 48 when this picture in Maine was taken. The story behind it is that they had just dropped my brother, my younger brother, off at a camp in Maine. We grew up in the South Bronx, and my parents' determination was that we would never, ever spend a summer in the South Bronx because that's where kids went wrong. Right? That's when you had plenty of time to get involved in all the things that my parents most feared. So every single summer, they put their pennies together, and I spent no summers with my parents. They took me to Vermont. Thanks to affirmative action, let me be clear, there was a wonderful camp run by the Quakers that would take kids from the inner city, and I could stay there for 2.5 months. Same in Maine, my brother would go for 2.5 months. But let me share with you that in order to afford this, as well as to make sure that we did not go to school in the South Bronx, my father worked 4 jobs, and my mother worked 2 jobs, so between them they worked 6 jobs, and here was what my father used to do. He would get up in the morning, put on a suit and tie, and impress me and everybody else in the South Bronx area where I live by walking to the number 4 subway on the IRT in New York. New Yorkers here? Walk to the IRT and ride down to to Grand Central Station, where he was a real estate banker who all day did mortgage assessments and appraisals for residential properties, right? But he did not earn a living wage doing that. So at 5 o'clock, he would come home in his suit, sit down and eat dinner, take a nap, and then begin his nighttime job, working 8 hours driving the same subway he had ridden to work that morning. So he rode the number 4 to Woodlawn in order to go to work for his first job, and then drove the number 4 to Woodlawn for 8 hours after that, and did 2 other jobs in addition to that, side jobs like being the superintendent of a building. I could tell you some very funny stories about that because I used to go along on the weekend. That's how you die at age 49, right? And my mother, similarly, died, let's just say, earlier than the age I am right now, and I want you to be thinking that's really too young, right? The reason I tell you that is because, yeah, my father's a little portly around the girth here, and I will tell you that they did party a little bit after we left for the summer, but my ask of you is to recall that social determinants of health distribution that I think had a much more important impact on their lives than any of their family history, than their access to medical care. In fact, the social and medical conditions that limited my educational opportunities unless they could work to pay the $4,000 that was their copay for tuition for me to go to a private school. That's what, in my view, caused their early demise. They had to do what very few people should have to do in order to overcome the social conditions. Here's the school I would have gone to if they had left me there. And here's the school. Oh, I should have had a picture. I'm so sorry. It's bucolic. Think of it. It's as beautiful as your campus. I went to Fieldston, and I thought I had stuck the picture in. But it was my education that made them decide 4 jobs, 2 jobs. That's what they needed to do. And it's because education is so highly correlated to health. I'm going to quickly go to a couple of conclusions. This is just evidence of the correlation between health outcomes and life expectancy. You go to high school, you live longer, period, no matter what social demography you're in. So my parents had it right. I stand here before you, I get that wonderful introduction because they made sure that I didn't go to school in the South Bronx. Any of my friends who did did not get to stand here before you, as they don't have the kind of jobs that they have, that you have. In fact, I went to a funeral recently, and I can tell you that their outcomes are pretty bad. So democracy improves health. There is an association between democracy and good health, but that association is clearly an association between good democracy and good health. And in fact, bad democracy produces bad health. Healthy democracies are the result of equitable participation, fair representation, and the ideals that preserve the rule of law. The things that we said are truths that we hold evident, self-evident, that created the democracy, that said all were created equal. That's the way to pursue a healthy democracy. Now, here's, out of order, a picture of my high school. It's pretty nice, right? And quite different. So what are the implications? I'll end here. Well, the implications to me are, if you care at all about civil rights and civil liberties, you care quite a lot about the state of our democracy. And the way that you can show your caring, measure your progress, is by looking not just at the health of the population, the American population, but look at the disparities and differences among the health outcomes in our population. Why did Norman Daniels say that justice is evidence of health, that health is just a byproduct of justice? Because to the extent that the social determinants of health are disparately distributed is the exact extent to which civil liberties and civil rights will be disparately distributed among our population. So if you care at all about civil rights, if you care at all about civil liberties, what you should care deeply about is the state and health of our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. That was outstanding. Would you be open to answering perhaps a few questions from interested members of the audience? Anybody have a question? Colleen, please.
Thank you so much for that. Incredibly rich and important talk. I have a question that's also a suggestion, so picking up on the initial offer. So, social scientists will distinguish between subjective perceptions of legitimacy and objective kind of measures of legitimacy. So it struck me a lot of the metrics for elections in health are around kind of what in fact do elections look like. But part of the problem, I think, in the U.S. today is around the perception piece, whether or not that tracks or maps onto what the objective measures are like. So I just wonder if your thoughts about the way that the correlations that you're talking about in terms of democracy, to what extent they're also about the subjective piece, the perceptions of what elections were like, what rights are held, as much as they're about the hard measures that we look at.
Yeah, great question. I'll tell you where I'm likely to be able to find research. I'm thinking about problems that I can describe in the research of others. I'm using secondary research. If I were to design an experiment, I'd do a survey of people's perceptions of elections. But I'm likely to be able to find, and I have a hint because I've seen a couple of studies that tell us about the extent to which election outcomes are respected, right? So in fact, we can look back at John Adams' rule of law when he talks about the rule of law and his concern about tyranny. He's very concerned with not only that elections occur, that they not just reflect the tyranny of what he called the majority, but that people would actually do what the elections tell them they must do and follow the elected officials. We can probably find measures, right? There are measures of the extent to which a elected outcome or a outcome that was the result of an election is or is not respected or followed, and have some sense of whether that correlates or doesn't correlate with health. I bet we could do that easily, pretty easily actually. Think about it in this country. All we'd have to do is, for example, we could take because I know this data pretty well, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. We could take the fact that it was enacted in 2010, right? And then we could look at the 70 efforts legislatively to repeal and replace it, right? And that could give us a level of, a measure, if you will, of how respected that elected outcome was or was not. We could go back in history and we could think about the fact that, Brown versus Board of Education happened, and then there was 10 years of massive resistance, and think about that as an indication of whether or not the rule of law is or is not followed. But really good question in an area for me to look through.
Romana.
Thank you so much. I'm a fangirl. I
Oh.
My question is, in looking at your hypothesis that if we look at the health of communities, we can see how healthy their democracies are. And as someone who is grew up Canadian, I wonder if it would be maybe not in the project you're working on, or it could be within the wrapped up in the project you're working on, but looking at sort of adjacent democracies like the one in Canada, and looking at those kinds of communities that also have those same sort of challenges to see whether their democracy is better, or whether where we're doing, having a sort of a baseline to see kind of a comparative ability to look at those same factors that you talked about and how they're being impacted in a different kind of democracy.
Great idea. It's a really good idea, especially since when we look at some of the health outcomes, I will say, admittedly, the health outcomes are not robust. In other words, I can't see a lot of health outcomes as they are correlated with democracy. But if I looked at Canada, I could see infant mortality, I could see death rates due to heart disease, I could see all 4 forms of large organ cancer, and then I could do a pretty accessible rating of the level of democracy on a couple of metrics there, and then say, how do these compare? Some of the most exciting findings early on, when I thought I was onto something, were international findings. For example, that one study that talked about accessibility of voting. So here I like to think about what it means to have, I could do this state by state, voter ID laws, the mail-in ballots, whether you can automatically register to vote at a certain age, right? That's a Brazilian study. It's a great study because it not only looks at what health outcomes were, but it also looks at the outcome of health legislation. So where were there more likely to be pro-health policies, and those were where there were more accessible voting.
I have one quick follow-up question just with respect to your understanding of ACA. So my question is about privacy. So I noticed that you talked a lot about all of the other determinants of health, but maybe what the role of privacy and ethics and how that impacts the democracy aspect of it. Maybe
You want me never to finish this paper.
I'm just fascinated by this topic, so thank you.
It's a great idea.
Hi. My question was, why do you think in those areas where there was mixed results about the prevalence of labor unions, was there a correlation with negative outcomes? And if you've noticed any distinctions in the quality, I guess, of the labor union in those places, in those areas, and in places where there's a labor union that doesn't necessarily have that negative outcome with health?
Yeah, the real answer is I don't know yet. And I'm a little afraid to speculate because my father held a union card for the transit authority, sure, and he's going to roll over in his grave when I tell him the sort of antisocial outcomes of the labor unions at the time. Now, a lot has to do, I'm not sure is the real answer, okay? So I don't want to be held to this if this is a recording. I'm not sure about what I'm about to say, right? Labor unions have a sort of mixed and sordid history, right? They are very important ways in which collective action occurs to establish rules and a balance of power, if you will. And I want to establish my labor creds. I once taught in Dublin. We were on our way to the Guinness factory, which is what you got to do if you're in Dublin, with my students. The union was on strike, and I was like, yeah, we're not going in here because I don't cross picket lines. I just want to establish my creds. I did go to Jameson factory, and became a whiskey drinker after that. But I think labor's also have an antisocial element. Labor unions have an antisocial element. There is a exclusionary power difference that represents um, uh, the views and rights of the most powerful majority of the labor union, right? So the best example I can give you, I hope the tape is off because now I'm really going to get myself in trouble. The best example I can give you is why I wondered why the LGBTQ movement always started with marriage. Like that was the biggie. That was the big issue. I'm sorry. I think it's a big issue, Robin. I really do. But I mean, trans people are getting shot in the street, right? And there are so many big issues. Labor unions kind of work the same way. The least common denominator of the most important thing to the majority is what they will advance, right? I want my lunch hour, right? Or I want, and fill in the blank. It's not necessarily what the entirety of the represented class needs. And I think that is probably part of the problem that labor unions are not as representative as they are want to be. They eliminate the level of discretion. Please, I believe my father is probably rolling over in his grave, right? I'm just not sure, but it really is, it's replicable. I've seen 2 studies now that say the presence of labor unions is actually inversely related to health outcomes like infant mortality. I'm sorry.
So we got time for a couple more. So
Hi, I've got the microphone. I'm a guest here. I am so honored to hear you speak. I'm a physician. I'm with the medical school here. I want to tell you that I'm working with a group of people who are absolutely passionate about the nexus of democracy and healthcare. And in fact, there are groups that are fairly progressive that will wear a badge that says vote ER, and it's a nonpartisan way to say to a patient, do you smoke, do you drink, are you registered to vote, do you wear a helmet, do you have a gun in your house?
Hey.
And so there's some resistance because by definition, asking people if they're registered to vote could be perceived as partisan, and we already have to ask so many other questions. But and so thank you for what you're doing. I believe so strongly of this nexus of democracy and health. Have you worked in terms of your paper? Have you worked with some of the licensing the committees or any of the medical schools in terms of how we define, how we take a history, how to go beyond the do you use alcohol? Are you smoking? Do you, are you registered to vote? How do we? I think working with the medical societies might help.
This is so fascinating. Yeah, this is so fascinating because I go around the country all the time now as Dayna, and I say my research has an impact. My school has an impact. We are use-inspired researchers, right? Really, all I've done so far is sort of talk about description. Not suppose I'm absolutely right, then what? What do we do? What do we actually do to implement? Let's say I'm exactly right, no dispute. All my data goes one way. Then the only way to act on it is to increase participation and to increase equality and to increase the decrease of fraud. And that has to be done at multiple levels. And what you're saying is we could do it is part of the health delivery model. I hadn't thought of it brilliant, right? Sometimes when I do this sort of advocacy talk, know your rights, trying to increase the pipeline of students coming to law schools and high school audience, I tell them at the end, you gotta vote. That's the thing you have to do. Don't sit out, you gotta go out, and it matters who is in charge. But boy, isn't it an interesting place to activate, let's say if I'm right, this connection in the healthcare delivery model. We've seen that it works very well with medical legal partnerships, right? We can we can address a lot of the social problems that are social determinants of health by making sure that part of the medical team includes a lawyer or a social worker that gets you to a lawyer. Maybe we can solve some more of the democratic connections by making sure we get people to learn.
Thank you so much for that. Everything you said resonated with me today. Your personal story and how you wove that into this fascinating and I think quite valid argument. What I was thinking when you were speaking about education as one of the factors or determinants of social determinants of health, given that we are seeing constant reflection or speculation that education is changing and it's becoming less and less robust in terms of how students are taught to read or how people are using critical thinking. How would the changing educational landscape as we predicted affect your hypothesis?
Very, very directly. So, of course, as a dean of the law school, I'm concerned with the assault on higher education, right? Um, and and I think that the assault, or I should say, the attempt to take control over higher education, is evinced or evocative of other authoritarian movements historically around the world. And that suggests to me that control over the education system is something that moves along that continuum, moves a country away from democracy and more towards autocracy because it controls critical thinking, as you've said in your question, and it controls the ability to, rewrite history, rewrite the and constrain, for example, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and the kind of human and civil rights that will inform participation in government, right? This is one of the most important reasons that I think, and following your question, wherever you are, if you're ready to act on the limited evidence that I produced today, you can do it in absolutely any arena that you find yourself, right? If you are a parent in a K through 12 school, you can act on increasing democracy by making sure that all students have access to IB and special preparation for college courses. If you are in higher education like we are, we can lead a school and make sure we equip an army of critical thinkers to go out and change the law. This is what makes our job so meaningful, right? We think we are part of the solution because we get to interact with students who are going to change the world, right? But you can also do this in your medical practice. You can do this in your sports team. There's no place that you cannot improve democracy if that's what you believe is important to do in order to improve society. And I do think it ends up being all of our job. I do think you don't have to necessarily run for office or stand up in a podium or march, although I have slides at the end that say you should march, right? Legally, and within the code of conduct of the university for sure. But I do believe that there's a place for each and every person to express the vital importance of protecting democracy in the United States.
Why don't we have one more? Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for this provocative presentation, already changing the way I've been thinking about these issues. My puzzle is, if we can measure the justness of our society by looking at our health, how do you think about the time signature of that measure? Coming especially from an environmental law perspective, it can take years or decades or generations to see all of the health impacts of some policies. So that makes me think of health as a kind of product of historical and present justice. Now, maybe that's like a feature of your approach rather than a bug, but I guess the question is, what time scope are you most interested in capturing, and how should we think about this interplay?
I wish you hadn't called on her.
So if you would, I will give you the option, because Arden has a habit of asking very
That is an
provocative questions.
awesome question. That is an awesome question.
If you want to give us the 20-second version, and then you guys can have a conversation after the committee of the whole.
Yeah, good. Yeah. All of my outcomes, I'm going to have to, all of those independent explanatory variables, I'm going to have to say something about the time signature, right? I'm going to have to say, or maybe I make a history variable, don't know for sure, right? I do a historical variable, but you're absolutely right. You're another person that doesn't want me to ever finish this paper, right? But great question. I will definitely take it under advisement.
Thank you. This was wonderful. We appreciate it. if you wouldn't mind, I know we've already prevailed upon you, but I'm sure there are folks who would like to come up and talk with you. So please feel free to do so.
I do want to say one more thank you. I have a very dear friend who is on your faculty, and we had breakfast this morning, and I thought, oh my gosh, we've been colleagues for so long, Robin Wilson. And I try to think back, when did we meet?